Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is Melanie Daly, and it is my pleasure to introduce Father Don Farnan.
Welcome back again to this podcast at Rockhurst University, Upon This Rock. Today we have a wonderful guest and a friend and a known entity here at Rockhurst University, Dr. Rick Janet. Rick, welcome to you today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and Rick, I know that you are a Missourian originally, and back here in Missouri, you went away to Notre Dame for a little while, but this is home. Do you mind just sharing a little bit about yourself and then how you got to Rockhurst in 1985?
Sure. Although you may be sorry that you asked because I have the tendency to talk. But yeah, I was born in southeast Missouri and grew up actually in the shadow of a lot of Catholic institutions run by the Vincentian order, and so I got to know a lot of Vincentian priests. Went away for grad school to the University of Notre Dame, and then returned to southeast Missouri and taught at a seminary for the Vincentian order for 3 years before I came here in 1985.
And some of our listeners will know about the Vincentians in Perryville, Missouri, and the Vincentians were certainly known for educating so many of the priests that are serving in our area and throughout the region of the Midwest.
Yeah, that was one of their primary apostolates, coming out of France in the 17th century. St. Vincent de Paul,
Right.
Was known for service to the poor, and the poor meant more than just the materially poor. It meant people who needed instruction and comfort. He was known as the saint for the galley slaves, for instance. And yeah, the Vincentians are a remarkable group of men and women. The Vincentian family tree includes the Daughters of Charity.
Sure. Yeah. And here in our region, we have the Ozanam home. We have the Sisters of Charity in Leavenworth. Of course, the Daughters of Charity here in Kansas City, Seton Center, and some of the great works that are going on and some of those wonderful people. But I'm going to guess in southern Missouri, your family was in the minority as a Catholic. There probably weren't a whole lot of Catholics or a Catholic culture in which you grew up, I suppose.
Right. Especially, when I grew up in years ago, it was. As a matter of fact, I think fondly of it. I think I grew up thinking there were two kinds of people, Catholics and then publics. The people who went to the Catholic school and the people who went to the public school. It's obviously changed as much has, and Catholics have become much more assimilated even in southeast Missouri. Although when you get south of Cape Girardeau into the Boot Hill proper, Catholics are a very distinct minority. There's a pocket here and there of very Catholic towns. I'm thinking of a place called Kelso.
I've been to a little town called Jackson there.
Jackson's real close to Cape. Kelso's a place where when I grew up, they had a priest who had been there since Prohibition. As a matter of fact, he was made pastor and stayed there for like 50 years, Monsignor Cosencoten.
Wow!
And there were three things in town. There was the Catholic Church, there was the softball field across, and there was the tavern.
And the tavern, yes, it's a good town. Yes. Well, Rick, you as a student, you were probably a pretty good student, and you got interested in history there along the way and wanted to dedicate your education and kind of the focal points in undergrad and grad to looking at history. And we need to know our history as we go forward to our future.
Yeah, I've always been drawn to history. If for no other reason, as a young child, I thought history was simply a good story. I mean, there's some rousing good stories about the past. And then obviously as I grew and studied, I began to see the relevance of history and how knowing something about the past, how it broadens, our minds in so many ways. Someone famously said that the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. So studying history is kind of like foreign travel. It helps you learn and understand more people, and in the process helps you learn and understand yourself. I was also very interested, obviously I was my family, very faithful Catholics, and I became very interested in the history of religion. And that's what, when I studied at the University of Notre Dame, my research area veered into religious history. I had an excellent mentor there, who happened to be a priest from the Archdiocese of St. Paul and was a renowned scholar of the Reformation and of 19th century Victorian England, John Henry Newman and the Oxford movement and the like. So I've had some, really good role models in that regard.
And religion has played into so much about history, whether it's the arts or the literature or education itself. The first universities were Catholic universities. And the way of being educated was kind of the way of being Catholic, or we're certainly picking up on so many of the greats that were out there setting the foundation. And it kind of leads us into the task that you're given here in your final year here at Rockhurst University. Yes. And Melanie and I were talking before you came in about the Catholic intellectual tradition, which is a term that is used here, and it's used in Catholic universities around the country and probably far beyond, but probably is not very well known to most of our listeners. Do you mind just speaking a little bit about that?
Certainly. The term Catholic intellectual tradition is, it has circulated recently. It's a very old concept. I mean, as old as the church, as old as the faith. But the term itself, Catholic intellectual tradition, is relatively new, just a few decades old.
Yes.
There has long been this body of knowledge and this approach to learning that we call the Catholic intellectual tradition. And it's both of those. It's the accumulated wisdom of 2,000 years as Catholic and Christian and non-Catholic and non-Christian thinkers have debated and dialogued about truth. But it's also a way of approaching learning, a way of pursuing truth, a way of learning. For many years in Catholic universities, that actually, the Catholic intellectual tradition was practiced, but the term wasn't used because it was simply what happened in Catholic universities. It doesn't make sense to us, but if you ask somebody 50 or 70 years ago, what's the Catholic intellectual tradition, they would have been perplexed. They would have just said, well, it's simply what happens in Catholic schools.
Right.
And one of the reasons is because of the nature of Catholic schools and the fact that universities like Rockhurst 50, 60, 70 years ago were largely staffed by Jesuits and other religious. And they were steeped in this tradition of learning and in this body of knowledge. That's how they were formed.
Sure.
So the Catholic intellectual tradition would have simply been what the Jesuits did at places like Rockhurst. In the last 50 or 60 years, as the numbers of priests and Jesuits included and other members of religious orders who sponsor colleges, as their numbers have declined, the concern has been, well, how do we preserve this learning, this body of knowledge, this thing, whatever it is, that makes us Catholic? Because that's what universities are about, teaching and learning. There's a lot of other things that go on at universities, a lot of other types of formation, including physical and social.
Sure. But
at its heart, a university is about learning. And so the Catholic intellectual tradition is how Catholic schools teach and learn. With fewer Jesuits, we've had to pay more attention then to, in places like Rockhurst, to how do we preserve that? How do we transmit it? And so in the last 50 years, there's been all sorts of work and all sorts of studies about Catholic identity, what makes a university Catholic, and about this fundamental intellectual approach that we began calling the Catholic intellectual tradition. My task this academic year has been to study this more in a more focused way, and with an eye towards completing a report for the provost office on the Catholic intellectual tradition, what it is, and how it could be enhanced and promoted better at Rockhurst.
Boy, that's tremendous. Melanie, thinking about, those three words and how they line up, and you and I, you're from the Northland, and I was in the Northland before coming here to Rockhurst this past year, and I was a part of Borromeo Academy next to your parish at St. Gabriel's, and St. Gabriel's is using this similar model, the classical liberal arts model of education, which ties in very well, not just with the 2,000-year history of Christianity, but even before that, you go back to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and setting the foundation. But even in our grade schools, we talk about a foundation of grammar, because we've got to know the language, and then we build upon it the logic and the reason and the critical thinking, and then we do the demonstrations and we show how we are learning. And that too is a part of the Catholic intellectual tradition, but there's so much more to it, isn't there? I mean, there are things that differentiate Catholic universities, and I think there are about 225 Catholic universities in the United States, and that would make them different from whether they're large state universities or small colleges. And there are things about our sacramentality, the idea of mediators in the church with our pope and our bishop and our priests, and utilizing those sacraments. And then, of course, how we live in communion in maybe a different way than other Christians do. So there are a lot of things that play into the tradition, a lot of things that play into being Catholic, and of course, intellectual. You and I were both products of Rockhurst, and hopefully we're smarter and better because of it, but that intellectual play. Melanie, the university has changed a little bit since you were here.
Right. Yeah, we were talking about that before you got here, Dr. Janet, just how, this has always been around, but when did it become more of an organized thing that we're talking about? When did it become labeled as such?
Yeah, and as I said, it would have been decades ago, given a number of broad cultural changes and demographic changes and changes within the church. I'm thinking of the Second Vatican Council, for instance, which kind of when the church kind of looked anew at its place in the world. I'm thinking about changes in the Catholic community, which has become much more assimilated into the broader American culture. And so when you have a combination of fewer religious teaching and then these broad cultural and demographic and social changes, it causes you, and I think in a very positive way, to have to think, well, then what makes us Catholic? And especially, a lot of institutions that call themselves Catholic are addressing that. But for a college, it starts with this fundamental intellectual and academic mission. As Father Farnan said, there's a couple of key characteristics to it. One is, as I've already mentioned, it's a body of knowledge accumulated over centuries, but it's also a way of approaching and learning and seeking truth. As that is done in dialogue over 2,000 years, or as Father Farnan said, even earlier, because many Catholic thinkers have been influenced deeply by pre-Christian and thought, by classical Greek and Roman thought and the like, and that's continued. That dialogue has continued over the centuries. But something's emerged from it. Some key elements and characteristics have emerged. Father Farnan pointed out one of the most fundamental, and that's this notion of sacramentality, the idea that the things we see, the physical things that surround us, nature included, are reflections of something else. Learning about them might lead our minds to other things. As Catholics, we know what the sacraments are, and of course, when I was raised, we had to memorize it. Sacraments are outward signs instituted by Christ to give grace,
yes,
right?
Of course, yeah.
And if you broaden that, any and everything that we learn can lead our minds to God, to higher things. So that's That's a fundamental characteristic. Another fundamental characteristic is the compatibility of faith and reason. The idea that the two are not in conflict at all. This is much on my mind, not just because of this report, but it's what I teach. I'm teaching this semester a class called Science, Religion, and Magic.
Oh boy, that's got to be fun.
It is fun, and especially, as you might imagine, the magic part, right. Because it's not something that we think about, because today we're used to compartmentalizing. Yeah, these are where my religious views go. These are the scientific facts. Here's my faith, and then there's this stuff over here called magic. But throughout, especially Western history, the three have been much more closely aligned. And in those Western universities, those early Western universities that Father Don talked about, if you would have asked, anyone, well, is that fundamentally religious or is that scientific? They would have looked at you like, what do you mean? It's all the same. Everything joins together in seeking truth. So the Catholic intellectual tradition sees no contradiction between faith and science, for instance. Right. Everything works together to pursue truth.
And that's why we want our students to follow logic and to be reasonable and to be critical thinkers, because faith and reason are so intimate, so closely related. And they always draw us, as sometimes we also say in the classical model, as to beauty, truth, and goodness. And Pope Francis says that those are all God, because if you have one of them, it's going to draw you to the other two. And we're always being drawn to God through beauty, truth, and goodness, and that wonder that we have in learning and in education. It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and it also, now, if you look at it in a certain way, as some people have over the years, if you look at it in a very critical way, and if you misunderstand it, you might think, Catholic schools, any religious faith-based schools, they're mainly about religious and moral formation. They don't care as much about the intellectual, formation. In other words, well, this is a form of censorship. There is no academic freedom in a Catholic school. Nothing could be further from the truth because of this notion that faith and reason work together. You might argue that places that refuse to consider the element of faith and how it enters into the human equation, they are the ones that aren't, considering the big picture, because we're more than just, as human beings, we're more than just scientific fact. Right. A collection of chemicals and the like. I ask students this all the time. If you believe everything can be reduced to facts and numbers, then I ask students, look at your ACT scores. Do you think that score tells me who you are and how smart you are? No, none of us thinks. Well,
we'd be in trouble, wouldn't we?
Yeah. There's much more, that goes into our intelligence than simply the way we responded one day to this test. There's much more that makes us human. So, I think that there is no freer intellectual tradition than the Catholic tradition.
Would you say then that students at Rockhurst and Benedictine and Avila and Conception, the Catholic colleges in this area, that they would be a little more tuned into that sense because of sacramentality, or understanding the sacraments, but we also say the sacramentals. So the Catholics could recite to you what are the seven sacraments, but they're also sacramentals. And those things are just known out there in the world, to see the face of Christ in one another and in the poor, or to take water, a symbol of baptism, but to realize how water is life. and water can bring new life, the fountain of life, or just out in nature with, it's not the scientific only about the tree and the bush and the flowers, but to see the beauty of God in that creation. That's the sacramental life. Does broaden us a little bit, doesn't it? Or?
I think so. And I think some of the best artists, musicians and composers, writers, novelists, poets, and even filmmakers. There are Catholic filmmakers, sure. And some of them, might surprise you. Martin Scorsese is known for his Catholic sensibility. I think that's one of the things that this sensibility, this notion that, there's more to life than what I can see and feel and touch. And the stories that we tell, the people that we meet can lead us, to consideration of higher things. That's what Scorsese does in his films, for better or worse. That's what Catholic novelists and poets do. One of the most famous Catholic poets was a 19th century Jesuit, Gerard Manley Hopkins,
sure,
who talked, many of his poems reflected this notion of sensibility.
The earth is charged with the grandeur of God, right? It just got right out there.
Exactly. There's also a recent poet that I enjoy, Mary Oliver. I'm not even sure Mary Oliver is or was Catholic, but she had this Catholic sensibility.
A great spiritualist.
Yes. And she has a poem that I love. I think it's called Summertime or A Summer Day, something like that, where she talks about just walking in nature, and she starts describing things. She describes down to a grasshopper that she holds in her hand. And she says, I'm looking at a grasshopper, not all grasshoppers. I'm not generalized, just this one little grasshopper. And I'm watching this grasshopper's mouth. And then suddenly she broadens it. Reflection or an attempt to look and perceive and really understand that grasshopper suddenly makes her look at bigger things. And she, in the middle of the poem, she says, I don't know what prayer is, but I do know how to sink to my knees in the grass and to think about, life and God. And that is what prayer is, right?
That's pretty amazing. That's right. It is. It draws us into that union with the divine. And that's what she's calling us to. Well, Rick, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you just for our viewers, because I think they're very curious to know about your perspective, having been here since it was the mid to late 80s that you came. Is that right?
Yeah, 1985.
Now, I'm counting that up. That's 5 different decades that you've served here, and you're still a young man. So you've got a lot of future left, but it might be interesting for our listeners, and many of them who have been at Rockhurst through the decades, to look at the Catholicity, what makes us Catholic, look at the Jesuit connection, what makes us Jesuit, and to look at the sense of faith in action. I know this is throwing a lot at you, but just to kind of get a sense of where, in the time that you've been here, where you've seen it change, and hopefully in some ways to see it grow. And then we'll circle back to the idea of the core curriculum and those sorts of things.
Sure. Well, I came to Rockhurst in 1985, and Rockhurst was in the process, probably, nearing the end of a process of sort of turning over the governance of the university to lay people. Before I came, almost every dean would have been a Jesuit, and practically every administrator and many faculty. When I got here, that was changing. It had already started, but the president was Father Wise, Robert Wise.
Absolutely. Came in 1977. And before him, of course, Father Van Akron, and he served as the chancellor. And I believe he came about 59. So there's that continuity.
He was chancellor when I was here. And you talk about, great characters. That's one of the things that looms large in my mind, that many of the people that I remember from that long ago were great characters. And many of those great characters were Jesuit, like Father Freeman, Father Dawes. Yeah. One of my favorite, Father Dawes. Yeah. We were talking about sacramentality. You talk about somebody who recognized that. Father Dawes did a lot of things, but one of the things that he undertook was to make sure that the hallways, sounds like a small thing, but the classrooms and hallways were adorned with art. And it was the kind of art that you would look at and that you would reflect on, and that would, raise your mind to higher things. I remember visiting him. He had a workshop in what's now called Van Akkeren Hall, which is now a classroom and office building, which was then the Jesuit residence, where he did nothing but frame prints to hang, throughout the university. He was also in charge of the visiting scholar lecture series. And he was a master of, I don't know how he did it, because he had a shoestring budget, but he would bring in the most prominent speakers. I mean, the Robert Frosts and John F. Kennedys of the world, to speak on campus, because, again, he thought that's what a university does, that, you live in this intellectual presence, but you also connect it to the broader world. So I have fond memories of those early days. Since then, a lot of things have changed, including, we were talking earlier about the curriculum, and we might get back to that. But one of the things, by the way, that's changed for the better, when I came, the faculty teaching load was 4-4, which means you taught 4 classes a semester, and each semester, and each class would have maybe 35 people in it. So you were teaching, upwards of 100 to 150 students a semester. That was our primary mission. We reduced that a little bit because the university began to see that it's good for faculty to have the leisure, and by leisure I mean the productive time, not the play time, right, but the time to engage in scholarly activity, to read, to write, and to share your thoughts. So that's one of the changes that I've seen. While our focus is still on teaching, and that's primary, more and more faculty have engaged in scholarship. Faculty are writing books and articles, attending conferences that links us with this, broader academic world.
I'll interject one other thing that I think is true, and Melanie, you can certainly add if you want, but because of the size of the school and the small classes and the closeness with the professors, Rockhurst, and I say small colleges as opposed to state universities again, have such a gift because of that idea that the professors are going to have this time to publish and this time to write and this time to think. They're also spending a lot more time with students outside of the classroom and in the classroom in much more engagement. And it's not just lecture halls.
Right. You couldn't help but get to know your professor, and they you, for sure. Yeah.
And I hear so many of my peers that are now in our 60s who are talking about how profound that was and the impact that the professors made on them because they took personal interest in them and in their learning.
And that hasn't changed. And when students are surveyed after graduation, it's one of the things they say, is they talk about the faculty and engagement with the faculty and their satisfaction with that. Matter of fact, in the field that I teach in history, not everyone can say, not every young person, coming out of high school who's eager to make their way in the world, and not many of them would have said when they were 18 or 19 that, boy, that's all I want to do is read history. That pulls them back to the past. And I think this is one of the hallmarks of a good education. We talk about creating lifelong learners. Yep. Years after graduation, I've had students come back and say, "Wow, now I get why we were asked to take history and literature and philosophy and theology. Not that they didn't learn it while they were here, but that as they've had a lifetime to reflect on it, it's loomed larger and larger in their minds."
I think it also ties in well. When you're talking about Father Dawes, I didn't realize that he had impacted the university so much that way, from the Robert Frost and the JFKs that were here on campus. But putting up those art forms and things, David Brooks was our visiting scholar. I don't think we called him that, but the Rockhurst University leadership team had him as our springtime guest, and he was talking about the unconscious. Maybe he didn't speak about this, but in one of his books, he was saying there's the conscious learning, but the majority of our choices are made unconsciously. And with the beautiful art and the framing and the music and these things, literature, a university like this, if they have someone like a Father Dawes out there doing that, it seeps into the unconscious and helps us to also broaden our way of thought in the choices that we make.
And people who, alums from many years ago, this was before I even came, may remember a man named Lockhurst, Father Lockhurst, who had a tremendous reputation for trying to enhance the cultural life at Rockhurst, or Father Robert Burke.
Absolutely.
We're sitting here talking in the offices of what's called the Center for Arts and Letters. That's a direct this program which coordinates all of the cultural and artistic offerings, most of them for the public at Rockhurst, is the direct, descendant of people like Father Dawes and Father Lockhurst and Father Burke.
And they had such outreach beyond the student body to the alumni and the family of Rockhurst out in Kansas City. And Father Burke used to guide lots of trips. And Father Lockhurst, of course, was known across the street at St. Francis Xavier Parish. But he brought that sense of learning and the idea of understanding through so many venues and ways to the people, and the celebration of life and the expression of liturgy and all kinds of wonderful things.
Yeah, and all that is part of the Catholic intellectual tradition. We've talked about the compatibility of reason and faith. We've talked about the sacramental principle. Just a basic curiosity to want to know and to peel back, the kind of curiosity that makes you not accept pat answers, but want to peel back the layers until you find the meaning. It's not just the facts; it's the meaning behind that. Things also like we've implied this as we've talked about the notion that there's a unity to knowledge, that what happens in my theology class links to what happens in my management class or my biology class, and links to what happens outside the classroom.
That's one of the things I've noticed coming back here to Rockhurst this year, is to recognize that so many of the faculty members do incorporate the world into their classrooms. And the idea, we sometimes say in high schools, of service learning, but it is utilizing what we're learning in the classroom and tying it into what we do outside of the classroom and in our communities and giving back.
Absolutely. And that, I know whenever I was at Rockhurst, I was an elementary education major, and it was really driven home to us to always be a reflective practitioner. Okay, you know this stuff, not just from your elementary courses, but from your philosophy and theology and humanities. What are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge part of the Catholic intellectual.
And a lot of that stems from another basic characteristic of the Catholic intellectual tradition, and that's the idea of the dignity of each human person and the common good. Yeah. If you take that seriously, then what you do in the classroom extends beyond the classroom. You have to respect each and every person, and you have to work and serve for the community.
So then the Catholic social teachings play in perhaps as strong as the Ten Commandments and the 8 Beatitudes, and I guess at Rockhurst, the core values also, that those things are all a part of our education.
Yes, yeah.
So, Rick, it's one thing to be a Catholic university. It's another thing to be a Jesuit university, and it makes us a little more distinct. Are we one of about 27?
27 yeah. in the United States. Right. I think there is an organization, the Association of Jesuit Colleges and University. I think it counts St. John's and Belize, so there's 28. Yeah, and that's an interesting relationship and perception. People wonder, well, Jesuit Catholic? Are they the same? How do they relate to each other? Some people, as a matter of fact, prefer one or the other. They like what they see in Jesuits or whatever. And that has obviously changed historically. But I've had some interesting conversations with really learned and experienced Jesuits like Father Michael Sheeran, who was on campus now.
Right.
Father Sheeran was longtime president of Regis University and was director of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities. And he refers to Jesuit as a subset of Catholicism. I like to call it an accent. A Jesuit accent.
Okay.
We all
like
speak
that.
Catholic,
Yeah.
right? All of these universities speak Catholic, but some of us speak it with a Jesuit accent. Some of us speak it with a Franciscan accent. Some with a Benedictine accent. And given the different charisms and spiritualities of these religious communities, there may be different points of emphasis. But like some of the things that we've already talked about, that we've here and that we've identified as part of the broad Catholic intellectual tradition, are also the core values of the Jesuits. For instance, this notion of sacramentality. Here at Rockhurst, as a Jesuit institution, one of our core values is finding God in all things. That's sacramentality. This notion of the unity of knowledge, how everything comes together. That's what, in Jesuit parlance we call wisdom. The notion of curiosity and leading, and thinking and deeply and peeling back the layers. That's what Jesuits would call discernment, isn't it? So,
Sure.
they're obviously intimately connected. And the way I like to look at it is Jesuit is an accent. It's a subset.
I love that. I hadn't heard that before, but I like it. And I'm wondering if listeners out there, whether they are potential students here or those who are parents and grandparents of young people that might want their kids to speak with a certain accent, live out their faith in a certain way. I know with the Benedictines here in the Ora et Labora, their prayer and their work is the ebb and flow of life and of existence. And the Franciscans often identify, you think of St. Francis, kind of a modern day, as an old time hippie, somebody who was one with nature and really incorporated that into everything that he did. And also was willing to reach out to the poorest of the poor. And I think that's a part of why our Pope has taken that name as well, to the Vincentians, as you know, honoring Vincent de Paul and really putting their faith into action through service to the poor and being the congregation of the missions, I think is what they're called. If you meet a Vincentian, they always put CM after their names, kind of like the SJ after the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, which really grew up in the 16th century. And we know that was a hot time in the Catholic Church. It was the time of Martin Luther and the time that so many variations of Christianity were breaking off from Catholicism that wasn't probably called Catholicism at that time, but it was the followers of Christ. I think Catholic became more of a word to define a Roman Catholic after the 16th century. But you had King Henry in England, and you had the Zwingli brothers, and you had the Wesleys and the Methodist Church. And Spain was kind of protected by the Pyrenees Mountains, and I don't think they kind of got the word, people sometimes say, but a lot of people say that Spain saved the Catholic Church in that 16th century. You have Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross and Ignatius of Loyola that are coming out of there, and they're looking at different ways of being church. And I wonder if we're still true to that mission, or if we're even really clear what that mission is of the Society of Jesus. I think we are, but we have a charism that Ignatius brought to us. And, he sent his best away. Francis Xavier, you take your very best and you send him off because the missionary work of the church is so important. And it seems to me that even though in the 20th century, Jesuits are associated primarily with education, I guess in the minds of most people, it's really a missionary spirit, isn't it, of going into the world and making a difference.
It is. And as you said, it's all rooted in that Ignatian spirituality. To give you an example that would anchor it in this Catholic intellectual tradition, I called it an approach to learning. I also like to call it a habit of inquiry, a way of inquiring about truth. For the last 40 years or so, there's been a lot of conversation about the Ignatian paradigm of pedagogy. In other words, an Ignatian way of teaching. And I'm not an expert on it. We do have people on campus who know it very well. And there's plans to host on campus some workshops for faculty that would make us more intentional in using this Ignatian paradigm. But it's rooted in Ignatian spirituality. And as a matter of fact, it's rooted in the spiritual exercises themselves. Ignatius, this, spiritual directives that all Jesuits follow. And in a sense, and I'm oversimplifying here, but in one sense, it basically, the retreat director, the professor becomes a kind of retreat director. The student becomes the retreatant, and the course topic or materials are truth,
right?
God, and there's an interplay between those three things, and the dynamics of the classroom, are calculated to reflect that basic spirituality.
It's a beautiful way to look at it. I know we've probably got to wind down here soon. I'd love to keep going on some of these other topics, but I do think before we go, it might be interesting to get your perspective as you look back to your time here at Rockhurst and then look ahead to what the hopes might be for this institution, looking at our curriculum, looking at how we combine that with faith in action and how we try to set up students that are going to make communities better and live life with more integrity and have a real sense of building up God's kingdom in our midst. So do you mind just giving us some thoughts about what your hopes are for the future here?
Sure. As part of this report, one of the things I've done this year is survey what's being done at Rockhurst to promote Catholic identity and the Catholic intellectual or Jesuit Catholic mission in broadly. And much of it is very encouraging. We do things that I don't think we even know that we're doing. And that when you bring it all together, it's like, wow, I mean, we're doing things in the classroom just directly in terms of some of the classes we teach and the programs that we offer, like Catholic studies and theology and the like. But also in every discipline, there are courses, there are within courses, there are units and topics and subtopics that bring in this Catholic Jesuit perspective. And then beyond the classroom, service learning, you mentioned the attempt to link what happens in the classroom with a Jesuit commitment to, to serving others. There's just in and out of the classroom in every aspect. There's a lot of things going on at Rockhurst, and we need to bring it all together and see it as a whole. I'm trying to think, what are my hopes for Rockhurst? Rockhurst is not immune to what's affecting a lot of universities, especially small private universities today. And that is demographic changes. Some of you may have heard of this notion of a demographic cliff, which means there's fewer, there are going to be over the next few years, fewer high school students. And there are a lot of colleges trying to recruit those high school students. And that causes uncertainty in a lot of people's minds about, especially in smaller private schools that are so dependent on tuition. We don't have Harvard's, $50 billion
huge endowments. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So that can be a cause of concern. We're coming out of a pandemic and we're still trying to figure out, the country and the world as a whole and institutions and like Rockhurst, what are the effects of that pandemic? We had to teach in a different way. We had to operate in a different way. And some of the effects and consequences of that are still being worked out. We've changed our curriculum, our core curriculum. And, alums may look at the curriculum now and say, wow, it's smaller. You're not taking as much of this or that. But, and this is what gives me hope. In the middle of all that, the core curriculum, for instance, the core curriculum was carefully constructed, no matter how many or how few courses it's comprised of now, because there are a lot of pressures from professional programs, and accrediting bodies where
right.
we have to have this number of courses and this or that. But the core curriculum is still based on a coherent rationale and builds from fundamental foundational skills towards more higher level kinds of academic experiences. And here's one of the things that I'm very heartened by. The new core curriculum includes a cornerstone seminar. Every student, incoming student, has to take. I taught one of them last semester as part of a pilot program just to see what they'd be like. And what I was really encouraged by, these cornerstone seminars can be about any number of topics. The faculty member can choose the topic, but no matter what you choose, it has to have some common elements. And one of them is a very deliberate and intentional introduction to things Catholic and things Jesuit. I spent the first 2 or 3 weeks of the semester giving students an introduction. Who was Ignatius? What are the spiritual exercises? What is this Catholic intellectual tradition? So I guess what in a long-winded way, what I'm saying is it's hard to read the signs of the times. There's some uncertainty out there, given the broader culture and demographics and scarce resources that everyone are competing for. But the sign of hope is, and this is my greatest wish for Rockhurst, is that we cling to that fundamental mission, that those values, those Jesuit Catholic values that permeated, the Rockhurst experience in Father Van Akron's day, mm-hmm. and it's our job to make sure it continues to do so. This new core curriculum was based on that. This report I'm doing is supposed to end. I say supposed because I'm still not done with it.
You may not get to retire. Yeah.
It's supposed to make recommendations on how we might better deliver, especially in uncertain times. But it all comes down to good people, and I met, as I started off by saying, when I mentioned Father Dawes and people like that, I met good people when I came here, and I'm leaving good people as I retire.
Well, that's wonderful. That's beautiful. I know that when I was a student here, there were certain hours that were required of theology, I believe 15, certain hours of philosophy. I believe at that time it was 12, and that's probably gone down a little bit from the decade before me. But what I do see here, and I think is absolutely wonderful, is that we're tying philosophy and theology and the humanities into the aspects of business. You've got your business ethics, and you've got the morality that ties into the sciences, and for the nurses and those who are studying health sciences, that they're out there doing it a little bit differently because of the humanities and because of the philosophy and theology in particular. And I think that might differentiate Rockhurst and maybe some of the other Catholic schools and some of the other Jesuit schools from the large state universities. I know that sometimes young people are driven by certain other things. David Brooks, again, our springtime guest, has spoken about being ego-driven as opposed to being soul-driven. And usually in the first half of life, it is about the ego. We're wanting success and we're wanting to hit it rich quickly. And a lot of young people are finding they may not need college. Maybe they can get into some kind of a computer field out of their garage like others have made millions doing and strike it at that level. But at some point, people do come to the idea of what it means to be soul-driven, what refers to as that second mountain. And sometimes people come to the second mountain pretty early in life and they realize it's a lot bigger than that, and that our education ought to tie those things together at an earlier stage so that we can be more impactful and to find purpose and meaning in our lives out there at a younger age.
Yeah, here's a story I like to tell, and I don't know, I hesitate a little bit to name another institution, specifically, but I will. My oldest son attended and graduated from Washington University in St. Louis, a great academic institution. And it's been great for him professionally. When he was there, I remember a parent weekend visiting and meeting the Dean of Arts and Science. And here we are on the campus of WashU in St. Louis, a great academic institution, beautiful, facilities and abundant facilities, and a lot of money in the bank. Sure. And he asked me what I did. And when I told him that I taught here, he got almost this wistful look on his face, and he said, I wish we had a core curriculum like yours. And what he meant by that, as we talked, was they offer any and everything that right. Especially in the sciences, which is their forte. But they offer any and everything taught by the best and the brightest. But he saw that in that a place like Rockhurst, what the kind of education we deliver is one that is more holistic and coherent. That's built on this notion of the unity of knowledge, where, for instance, one of our professors of biology in a course on environmental science incorporates papal encyclicals, where
you wouldn't get that at a lot of places. No.
Where our business program and even in the MBA, I think, requires a course on corporate social responsibility.
I love it.
Where ethics is infused in all of our pre-professional programs, and I'm not saying that other places. I'm not saying Catholic colleges or Rockhurst has a monopoly on things like this.
It does differentiate us a little bit, doesn't it? Yeah. Melanie, do you have any other final thoughts before we sign off here today? I mean, I think the three of us are pretty optimistic about the future of education and here at Rockhurst.
For sure, yeah. I think all you have to do is look at our students. Nothing but positivity and hope when you look at the caliber of kids that we're getting, and then also the faculty and staff, if I do say so myself.
There you go. And there may be lots of tough times ahead, and I think we're looking at the decade ahead in particular and seeing how we weather through a storm if it comes, or be a light in the darkness if it does fade, but how we continue to work forth to know that what we have here is a wonderful offering to the future. And not just to young people, but maybe to older people too, because it's lifelong learning, isn't it? Yeah. Rick, any final words you want to offer before I sign off?
Oh, I don't know. I think I've used a lot of words already, but
they're good words.
I do thank you for having me, and I think, for instance, just conversations like this are a sign of the vitality of Rockhurst. And a hope for the future. I mean, the fact that 2 alums now back at Rockhurst, working in different capacities, and then one old timer who's finishing 38 years. That we can sit here and talk about ideas and the things that that really distinguish Rockhurst, and among them this Jesuit Catholic mission and tradition.
And that tradition maybe is what we'll end with, and just to take time to give thanks to all those holy men and women who have gone before us, and those who have set a very firm foundation for us in faith and in education. And the Bible says that we should praise those godly people. They were the subduers of the land. They were the bearers of faith. Their bodies are buried now, it says, but their names live on. Their souls are with God. Their spirits are with us, and their spirits can indeed inspire. So as we look at that sense of discernment in our world today, and how the Jesuit community and the Catholic universities can help us to recognize God in our presence and the Holy Spirit that can help us to make wise decisions, we know here that wisdom has built herself a home. And we pray that this home will be that foundation for all who come here. So again, we'll sign off, but thank you again, Rick, for being here, and Melanie, as always.